We are told everywhere that happiness is the key to life, but how do we go about trying to achieve this happiness? We eat junk food, scroll on social media, look at memes, watch mindless videos on YouTube, shows/movies on Netflix, drink alcohol, smoke, play video games, go to parties, watch porn, have casual sex, and in 3 words, we consume pleasure. And are we actually happy when we do these things? Or rather, how do we feel after we do these things? If pleasure is the element of happiness, why does it seem like today's world is more anxious, stressed, and depressed than it was when no such amounts of pleasure existed? What happens is that this modern pleasure brainwashes us and numbs us from reality, making us weak, dependent, tired, and anxious, and holding us back from achieving our true potential. What if I told you that there are not only alternative ways to actually become happier in the long term, but there is something that is actually even better than happiness? To begin to understand why and how modern pleasure brainwashes us, we need to look at the science behind it. You know already that I'm going to mention dopamine. So dopamine is a chemical inside of your brain that is an element of the overall dopamine system. Essentially, it's responsible for motivation and seeking pleasure. There's always some amount of dopamine circulating in our system, our baseline level of dopamine. And when we engage in something that we really want, this circulating dopamine peaks above baseline, creating a dopamine reward. However, when the stimulating thing or activity is over, the amount of circulating dopamine drops below baseline, and it means that we have less of it to use for the rest of the day.
Dopamine is a universal currency in all mammals, but especially in humans, for moving us toward goals. And how much dopamine is in our system at any one time compared to how much dopamine was in our system a few minutes ago, and how much we remember enjoying a particular experience of the past. That dictates your so-called quality of life and your desire to pursue things. This is really important. Dopamine is a currency, and it's the way that you track pleasure. It's the way that you track success. It's the way that you track whether or not you are doing well or doing poorly.
This is exactly why modern pleasure is so dangerous. As an example, when you get excited to watch your favorite TV show and watch it, you spend a lot of dopamine from your system. And because of that, when you need to go and do something less engaging, like working, you then need to sum up more of the willpower to actually do the thing. Modern pleasure almost always requires you to spend huge amounts of dopamine, and naturally things that are less engaging in the moment but can benefit you long term, like working out or being productive on your work, become way harder to do when there's that more stimulating and easy thing you could be doing. In the end, since it's way harder and more energy demanding to make yourself do harder things, you gravitate towards that pleasure because at least that gives you stimulation and chemical rewards for your brain. It keeps you in your comfort zone pretty much, and that's another way how modern pleasure brainwashes us. It either keeps you stagnant in one place or more often degrades you. When you have all these different pleasures to engage in, you don't feel the motivation to start that business or to become better in school or to try to learn a new skill or work out and so on. You sacrifice your potential for the high, and it doesn't even relax you. We always seem to think that after a long day, it is okay to just turn off your brain and play a video game or watch a movie, and in some situations that is okay. However, more often than not, we just tire ourselves more than relaxing. See, the best state you can be in life is to be balanced. With modern pleasure, you either engage in it momentarily and are high up, or suffer the motivational depletion effects after it and feel way down. So as an example, going to parties every Friday and drinking and smoking doesn't actually relax you after a week of work or school, but it actually makes you more anxious and stressed, and in turn, in a way, it just kind of makes you repeat that pleasurable activity more because at least that felt good in the moment. Overconsumption of modern pleasure feels good in the moment, but fails to provide any benefit long term. So what are we supposed to do? Avoid pleasure at all costs and choose only hard things? Not necessarily. There exists another state of being that is above high pleasure seeking and happiness that can actually elevate your existence. What is this other state of being? Living with meaning. Achieving meaning is the opposite of consuming pleasure. It requires work, sacrifice, and dedication that does not always result in the idea of happiness that we have nowadays. However, this doesn't mean that you are necessarily unhappy when you're living meaningfully. Look at it this way: if you overconsume very stimulating pleasure, then you are happy in the moment. But when the effects of that pleasure wear off, you become stressed, anxious, and sad. Then, to achieve that happiness that you felt for that short while, you engage in more pleasure, and the cycle repeats. You make your brain dependent on that, and in the long term, you suffer needlessly. Now, having real productive meaning in your life in terms of a fulfilling and healthy hobby, doing something valuable for yourself or others, and just doing something, pushing yourself toward some goal that just inspires you to act, whilst in the short term it might seem difficult to do and in some cases even boring, that going and pushing yourself towards achieving something great can actually make you more happier and more balanced in the long term. Actually, the greatest thing meaning unlocks is calmness. Calmness doesn't come only from meaning, which again is more work than pleasure, but it can actually come from pleasure if you engage in the right kinds of pleasure. Humans naturally seek pleasure, and with this video, I'm not claiming that you can become a superhuman that can actually live without pleasure, without experiencing pleasure ever. That's not really possible. Fortunately, there are healthy pleasure sources that can increase the quality of your life if you're prepared to make a few sacrifices and put in a little bit of work. Healthy pleasure sources are things like going to nature or reading books, or actually even engaging in regular pleasure like watching a TV show, but doing that with intention and limitation. Pretty much the lesson here is to learn to enjoy less. So let's say you really like video games and you spend a lot of your free time playing them. If you stop playing video games even for a few days and then start to limit your playtime for like 1 hour per day, you will find that you will actually enjoy that 1 hour way more than, let's say, gaming for 6 hours straight, and you will actually have more time in your day to do other meaningful things. Another example of enjoying less would be that if you limit or quit your engagement in modern pleasure and do what is now popularly known as a dopamine detox, after a few days of discomfort, you will realize and find that you start to enjoy things, dimension things like going to nature or reading books, way more than if you tried to do these things when you were engaging in very stimulating pleasure. But the best thing about learning to enjoy less is not that you live a more peaceful and balanced life, although that's great, but you actually start to enjoy and gain pleasure from doing hard things. If we get back to that meaning idea, I mentioned how it's more difficult to engage in it than in pleasure. If you stop or limit this pleasure consumption, then sitting down to build that business or working on your school or university work or just engaging in something that requires a little bit more effort for your improvement becomes pleasurable. This can happen to a point when you extract so much pleasure from doing productive work in whatever field you are in that this pleasure becomes more desirable than the pleasure you thought you couldn't live without before. To summarize this video, understand that overconsumption of modern pleasure brainwashes us into thinking that living pleasurably versus living meaningfully is more important. Limiting or quitting modern pleasure that hurt your quality of life after some time, after a while of discomfort, will result in enjoying less and more healthily of the things that seemed difficult before. Detoxing from very stimulating amounts of pleasure will create calmness and a good balance of life.